GLOBIS.
Thank you very much, Ray. And I'm extremely pleased today to have the opportunity to moderate this panel of very distinguished guests on the topic of immigration. I've wanted to do a panel discussion on immigration for some years now. One, because I'm an Australian, and Australia is a country of immigrants. More than half the population of Australia now are immigrants or the children of immigrants. And I've lived in Japan for 40 years. So I guess that qualifies me to be an immigrant in Japan. So having seen both sides, it's always been a topic that's been of great interest and very importance to me. So the government has passed a new immigration law, and that's really wonderful. But even before they passed the immigration law, there are whole towns up in Gunma Prefecture where 40% of the population are immigrants from South America. This year, in the coming of age ceremony in Shinjuku, more than 50% of the young people that came of age were non-Japanese. And if you go to any convenience store in central Tokyo, it's hard to believe that Japan doesn't actually have some form of immigration. So my first question to our panelists is, it looks like we've always had immigration, but no one talked about it. What's different now that this law is passed? Can we start with Matsuzaki-san, ladies first?
Thank you very much. I am on my day-to-day business trying to match the blue-collar workers to find a job. And we are running a job matching platform dedicated for blue-collar workers. Okay. On my day-to-day business, I struggle making the employer accept working with the foreigners. So the discussion held in this G1 summit, everyone speaks English and they're exposed to overseas cultures, different cultures. What I'm facing day to day is the employer who have never been abroad, who don't know what's happening in Singapore, or they don't know the cases of migrant workers in Australia. Okay, so the word that I heard here is it safe to work with foreigners? Aren't they dangerous? Or the skin colors. Okay. The horrible story I heard was it's a textile company. They wanted to work. They wanted to have a workforce in a factory, and they asked for a Singaporean because they think that they look similar to us. The skin color and features are similar to us, which they don't even know that Singaporean may be making more than us recently. So those kind of innocencies bring not the discrimination itself, but because they are innocent, we are not ready to accept the foreigners. Okay, the visa regulation has changed recently, and I'm foreseeing that Japan will change in the future, like Singapore. Singapore, if you look at Singapore, we 30% of the total workforce is brought from overseas. So the country is consistent like that. Okay, but the thing in Singapore is. It's a visa which can renew every 2 years up to 10 years. So they consider the foreigner as just a workforce. So in Japan case, it is the question that are we seriously going to bring the migrants which will stay here for the next and next and next generation? Are we ready to accept those migrant workers? Yes.
Thank you. So even though the new law has been passed, there still remains a fundamental question as to what should be the grand design for immigration in Japan.
Yes.
Is it long-term immigration or is it short-term guest workers or migrant workers?
To cover the shortage of workers, yes.
Okay. Great. Menju-san.
Well, just following the discussion before, my take about the change of governmental immigration policy is, I think this is the two aspects. One is this is historical, because the population continues and accelerates, so that this change of the policy has a fundamental impact, and this is just a first step for the accepting migrants from now on. But this has another aspect of this new law is that this is really half-baked policy because the government goal for this, the reason why government taking this policy is they just say this is to tackle the shortage of workers, not a tackle of the depopulation. So that government is trying to, or companies are trying to accept short-time workers, and those people just come to Japan to get money, and companies tend to hire those people just for transient reasons. But considering the depopulation in 2020s, from the governmental agency, it's expected to reach 5.5 million during 10 years. The population of Shikoku is only 3.8 million. Population of Hokkaido is 5.4 million, so that just 10 years, Shikoku will go on, or Hokkaido will go on, and that the population will continue and accelerate 2020 years on. And another, you mentioned about Shinjuku. I just currently serve as the chairman of the Shinjuku Multicultural Committee, which was created by the Shinjuku city. And 12% of the population of Shinjuku is foreigners, and coming from 135 countries. But Shinjuku become really a kind of, people think it's a chaos because of a lot of people. But actually, this is a very, how should I say, safe place, and there is a questionnaire to the Japanese resident about the question is the increase of the foreigners is a good thing or bad thing? The answer is that people said good thing is more than the people answered the bad thing. And so Shinjuku become a kind of the place for foreigners and also the younger Japanese come and make a new kind of experiment in business or any kind of new business. So this is a very chaotic place, but attract many young people, not only from other country, but also from Japan. So we need that kind of place, I think.
Great, that's amazing. 12% of the population from 135 countries, did you say, in Shinjuku? And more than half the Japanese residents saying that they think that this is a positive thing. I agree with you, it's small scale, but small scale success can be built up. I also thought it was quite interesting. There's two concepts here. There's the solution of shortage of workers, which is one path, and then there is the solution to depopulation. And if we look at Shikoku being, did you say 3 million, Hokkaido 5 million, the same as Hong Kong or Singapore, that's a very different issue, which requires more of a longer term. Jonathan, how do you think?
Yeah, I've been spending time in Nagano recently in a town called Iyama in a little farm village, and I thought I would be the only foreigner in the village and I would get to relive some of my early days in Japan where I was really special. And I show up and it turns out that my neighbor 2 doors down is Latvian. He's growing strawberries. He wants to start a jam business. Now, my point here is that there's a lot of immigration that we don't see, we don't think about in Japan. But we also have to put it in perspective. If you look at the numbers, still only about 2% of Japan's population is foreign-born. That's a lot less than countries that are immigration countries like Canada, where I'm from, like Australia. So it's not like Japan is secretly an incredibly diverse Canadian, Australian-style immigration country. There's just a little more than we think. And I think that the law that has passed recently is in part about getting the national conversation and the laws to catch up with that reality. You know, we're calling this the immigration law. Our, immigration law has passed in Japan. The government would not agree with that. It's not officially, it's not an immigration law. And in fact, if you follow the debate in Parliament, the main line of criticism taken by the opposition parties was, this is really an immigration law, isn't it? You are secretly forcing immigration on Japan, opening up Japan to immigration, but calling it by another name. I don't think that criticism was entirely fair, because if you look at the law, it's really a guest worker law. It's a guest worker law, and there are lots of different definitions of immigration. And depending on how long you're in the country, even if you come in as a guest worker, by many definitions, if you're here for a while, you're an immigrant. But I think in terms of fundamental principles and approaches, Japan is not there yet. The idea is that these people will come, they'll work for a few years, they won't bring their families, and then they'll go home. Okay? Some of them won't go home. Some of them will end up like us. And 20 or 40 years later, they're like, hey, still here. But the fundamental approach, and probably in most cases the reality, is that we are talking about people who are coming to fill an economic hole that Japan has right now, and will go home. They won't bring their families from overseas. They won't have kids here and then become, fill out the Japanese population. Again, it's about economics, it's about filling a labor shortage, it's not about shoring up the population, which you don't get unless you're basically willing to have people come, and not only for a few years, but for generations, right? So right now, the debate in Japan is at a point where we are only beginning to actually make the idea of guest workers legitimate. I mean, that was, this is a big step. The law is a big step because we're actually calling guest workers, where until now they had to go by secret names like technical trainees. Oh no, this is charity. This is global contribution. So only now, finally, I think Japan is at the point where it's willing to face the reality that, okay, these people are, including blue-collar workers, are part of the labor force in Japan and actually probably necessary. How many? Well, that's a point of debate. But that's a step. But are we now, if we are debating immigration, I don't think the country really yet is debating immigration. Yeah, so that's my story.
That's an interesting point. And I think you sort of have people like us who came and stayed, and then you have the so-called guest workers or migrant workers, the blue-collar workers who are coming in. You have your Latvian friend in Nagano who is growing strawberries. You have many foreign entrepreneurs who have started up businesses here. So it's actually a very, very dynamic and diverse group that have been contributing to Japan in many, many different ways. But as you say, the optics are really important. Someone said to me many, many years ago, Japan is form over substance. And so having that formalization of the law at least opens the door for people to have an open discussion about immigration or guest workers rather than calling them technical trainees or contribution to society. Tamura-san, looks like you have a lot of statistics there on your page.
Yeah, I'm Takutamura. I'm representing EDAS, EDAS, meaning everyone is different, whereas all people are the same. The law was enforced on April 1st. And before and after, the biggest difference is before, we felt the number of foreign people are increasing. And after, we believe that foreign people are increasing and will be increasing too. However, most of the foreign people are the guest workers because so for the last 6 years, the increase existed in the guest workers section, whereas not as much in the permanent resident section. Permanent section increased by like 2% a year, whereas the guest workers are, say, 10, 11%. So that means we are more thinking about the permanent resident likes Japan or not. Ross and Jonathan are little unusual people. And so that I think my organization's slogan is like Japan more than when you came to. And we are not ready for accepting people permanently yet. So while the guest workers are increasing, we are going to be ready for the educational system for the foreign people, not only for the Japanese, but also for their mother tongue as well.
Yeah, I think, when I was a young boy in Australia, in the first year of primary school, half the class did not speak English on day one. And yet in 3 months, being young kids, they're speaking perfect English. The problem was when we went to our friend's house to play, we couldn't communicate with their parents, or particularly their mother, because the father was at work. So what the Australian government did in the case of my school was they made us learn the language of our classmates. So in primary school, I learned Greek, Italian, and Yugoslav, a different one every year. And although I can't remember it, it was enough to be able to go and say "Konnichiwa, gochisousama deshita," and at least have a very superficial conversation with the family. And then in grade 6, in order to graduate, we had to teach a migrant family English, everyone in the class. So once every week, my father would drive me to Mahmoud's house. Mahmoud was from Lebanon, and he was a dentist in Lebanon, but a factory worker in Australia. The government provided me textbooks, and I would teach Mahmoud English for an hour. And after 3 weeks, he said, "Do you mind if my friend from the factory comes?" And I said, "Sure." In 5 weeks, we had 10 people learning English, and because they were a Muslim family, the ladies unfortunately were not allowed to learn English, but after the English lesson they would bring in cakes and sweets, and then Mahmoud would drive me home. I mean, in Australia today, to send your grade 6 kid into a Muslim household to teach them English would probably be quite a shocking thing for Australians today. But I think the point is, it's not just about teaching the foreigners to assimilate into Japan. And I'd like to ask Matsuzaki-san now, what can we do to help those owners of the factories, the people who are employing the foreign workers, understand the foreign workers? I think it was in Sendai, there was a convenience store, and they put up this display of all the different countries introducing their different workers so that they could communicate more with the people that were coming to shopping there. Is there something that we can be doing a little bit more to help the people assimilate?
I think everybody knows this story. When Titanic was sinking into the water, if you say you're going to be a hero to American, if you jump in, then they will jump in. And you know the story, if you say everybody's jumping in now, then Japanese will jump in. So I think it takes time. And then, so we mentioned that foreigner work in a convenience store, izakaya, but actually they are in a place that we don't even see. They are working in the factories where they produce the obento, for example. So there's a lot of place of foreigners in the hidden places. And then what I feel is, okay, so it's come from the innocences because they've never tried. And then once they try, they feel that, oh, they're not so bad. So it takes a time. It doesn't happen in one day, but it's little by little, step by step. So the neighbors, you hear from the neighbors that they hired foreigners and it's working. Then they feel like, oh, let's jump in. That's how the Japan will change.
Okay. Minji-san, from the work that you do, is there something that we can be doing if you think of where Japan needs to be in 20 years, the perfect immigration scenario? What are some of the things that we should be doing, or the government should be doing, in order to add on to the existing law?
Well, I think at this moment the government policy is just someone mentioned that this is a guest workers policy. That means people coming to Japan just to get money and return. But the best thing we can think of is the most talented people willing to come to Japan and stay with their family, and there is some route for them to come. And those routes are visible. So those people who are talented, who love to come to Japan, will come. But at this moment, that route is not very, very vague. Although the newly created specified skilled workers visa, there are 2 types. Second stage is they can bring their family and they can renew the visa. But that stage is very unclear. That's the route to that second stage very unclear. because debate in the national diet last year, some conservative politicians mentioned this is an immigration policy. We shouldn't do that. Because of that, that second stage was very, very unclear. But I think we have to kind of change that policy. Last year, I had a visitor from mayor from Yamagata came to see me. The question he asked me is, he wanted to increase the foreigners population in his city because his city tried everything to stop the depopulation. But depopulation cannot stop, and that accelerate. He followed all the instructions by the government to give for the rural development. It doesn't work. So as a last resort, he came to see me. He wanted to know how, in what way, his city can increase foreign population. So many rural communities coming to that stage. So I think its government should really think of the future of the rural community.
Is there a dynamic where the rural governments or the rural areas are a lot more, I don't know whether the word is accepting, but more positive or more needy of some sort of longer term immigration, and the central government is sort of shying away from it a little bit because of political reasons? I'm reminded of the story, I think it was a small village in the Goto Retto in Nagasaki, and they were suffering from depopulation, so they put up in their webpage that if you came to live in this village, they would give you 30,000 yen a month and a house. And no one applied. No one applied. And so they thought, well, what do we do? And they said, we're a dairy place, so why don't we throw in a cow? So they put up on the homepage that they would now give you 30,000 yen, a house, and a cow. And they got all these applicants. Not one from Japan. They were all from the Middle East and from South America. The power of Google Translation, people searching for cows. But there seems to be a much greater demand or need amongst the rural governments than an awareness amongst the rural governments, perhaps. Jonathan?
Yeah, and I actually think there's probably a lot more willingness to be creative and flexible among rural governments. I think we tend to see rural places and rural leaders as being inherently conservative, but my experience, Nagano, for example, but reporting also when I was a reporter at the New York Times and the FT, was often that rural leaders are willing to kind of think outside established rules more than leaders in urban areas. The question, I think, is how and why, right? Not so much as, the idea that immigrants can somehow shore up rural populations to the level where depopulation is no longer a problem, I think, unfortunately, is a fantasy. We're past that point, right? The number of foreigners that you'd have to bring into Japan to stop depopulation, either nationally or especially in rural areas where it's already gone a long way, is simply too high. In terms of stopping, or in terms of the general depopulation of Japan, immigration is a mitigation strategy. You can't solve the problem on that level. That said, okay, you can still help struggling communities bring in a younger group of workers, bring in a younger group of people. You can still make these communities healthier in a lot of ways through immigration. But when I was a reporter at the Times, I did a story on the trainee system, and I went to Gifu, where there are a lot of textile factories and garment factories staffed mostly, if not entirely, by these trainees, many of them women from Vietnam. And I knew about the trainee system and about all the problems that existed in it. And so it was great to do the on-the-ground reporting and speak to people involved. I wouldn't say the conditions that they faced surprised me. What did surprise me, actually, was I came away thinking, what is this even doing for Japan and for this region? Because you had all these factories where the entire workforce is now Vietnamese women. Maybe you had a supervisor who was Japanese. Okay, so they're not saving jobs. They're not saving Japanese jobs. If you move this factory to Vietnam, the net effect would be the same on Japanese jobs. Okay, well, so are they somehow supporting the local economy? Well, these women were underpaid, often abusively so. They lived in dormitories. They sent most of the money they made back to Vietnam to support their families and pay the bribes that they had to pay to the corrupt brokers that got them the job in the first place. So very little of the tiny wage that they were earning was going back into the economy. You know, they didn't go out very much because, you know, they didn't have any kind of language training or communication. I mean, this was the worst way to do it because you had, you know, there was very little benefit economically or socially for that local area. There's really what's the point? So for me, it's not so much that, you know, can we shore up the population? It's really about the how, right? And, you know, it's like, do you have that convenience store where they're sort of pretending that the Nepalese or Chinese worker behind the counter is Japanese, or do you have the one where the posters are up and we're saying, listen, these are new people who are going to be part of your community? I mean, I think that's a fundamentally different approach. So that is, I think, the choice that Japan is faced with now, right?
That's great. That's great. And I agree entirely with you. I mean, the guest worker dynamic doesn't really add much to the local economy.
It can. Again, even a limited guest worker system can be beneficial for the workers and for the economy. But when your fundamental approach is, I mean, you know, the factories in Gifu that I was looking at, I mean, the trainee system is presented as global, you know, sort of charity work by Japan, which it obviously isn't. The second line is, well, okay, it's actually an economic policy for Japan. I don't think it's even that. Yeah. I mean, when it goes that far, I think what it really is corporate welfare for a small number of factory owners who wouldn't be competitive without some underpaid workers. And that I mean, if that's the mentality for, I mean, it's clear that economic need, you know, the shortage of workers that's driven by depopulation in Japan is the thing that's changing the conversation around immigration now. But if it's purely couched in those terms, then you end up, you know, when nobody's happy, and, you know.
Just adding to what Jonathan said, if we really want to, push the depopulation of Japan, I think we should consider them as their own national. As for now, the foreigners are increasing, but they're just sending all the money back to their countries, so they're not spending here. If we want to integrate them as a consumer in this market, we have to really make them feel that they are the national here. So as Menju-san said, the policy is still half-baked.
Great. Tamura-san, you do a lot of work around diversity. And in my business, I can see very, very clearly that creativity and innovation come from diversity. The more diverse people we have in our team, the more we have that. How can we get more diversity? I mean, we've talked about the fact that Japan is not the most diverse culture, but how can we drive diversity, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. This might be a little bit off the track, but the technical trainees viewpoint, they are not that diverse because the 4 countries from Vietnam, China, and Philippines and Indonesia covers 90% of that workers, that category. So the number of people is increasing. However, not that diverse. The Shinjuku case is very unusual, I think, and to be for us, so that we can be very diverse oriented. We have to be sensitive to diversity, diversity and inclusion, and not only for foreign people, but also the women, LGBT, or handicapped as well. And that's a very basic point, I think. And we should not isolate working people from foreign countries. Let me show you one case. For the convenience stores subsidiary, the food factory, the 3 shifts are working on, and the night shift most of the workers became, say, Vietnamese people. Then Japanese workers in midnight eliminated, one by one, and finally the manager became Vietnamese who can speak Japanese to communicate with the Japanese managers in the daytime. And that caused most of the Vietnamese workers not to learn Japanese, not to communicate with Japanese at all. That's the very bad scenario, I think. So it's better to shuffle the working place or the any working environment as much as possible.
I remember a discussion, I think it was from last year's G1 Global, from the CEO of Seino Unyu, and he was talking about the fact that he makes all his foreign workers pray before the kamidana, like all the Japanese workers do every morning, because he said, we're a transport company, and every morning we pray that there's no accidents. And so it was an assimilation that, and he said that even there were different religions, people were very sort of happy and joined in this because it became a sort of a consolidation. Okay, I'd now like to turn to the audience. Does anyone have any questions, feedback, comments that we have? Martin, just wait for the mic.
Thanks, Ross, and thanks, team. I think it was Ben Franklin who said that visitors like fish begin to stink after 3 days. We know from the example of Germany and from examples of many countries, particularly post-war, that immigration produces problems. The pushback on Angela Merkel for accepting 1 million people, huge. The Brexit vote is largely attributed to anti-immigration feelings. We know that that we need to give immigrants, not guest workers, we need to make them immigrants, we need to give them rights, we need to give them a stake and a future in our societies, but at the same time, we know that that's going to cause problems. How do we resolve these tensions in Japan?
Anyone want to take that? Ranjit-san.
Well, I think comparing the other country, Japan actually has no choice because Japan is maybe only country which has a deep population. And without accepting migrants, our society will not be sustainable anymore. And that is a real fact. And I just saw the webpage of the Tama City near Tokyo. It has it shows 5 elderly home kind of list, waiting list. This 5 home has a capacity of about 200 or 300, and each home has about 500 waiters, people waiting for each home. That means 20 or 30 years waiting period at this moment. At this moment, so that will accelerate. That issue will accelerate. We have to accept migrants. So. We have to come up with a good, win-win solution. That Japan is a latecomer, so that we can learn from the failure of other countries, and the Japanese people necessarily be xenophobia or So I think many Japanese people are willing to accept, but they don't have much experiences, so that we give them the proper education. And the most important thing is the top of the country mentioned that from now on, Japan have to live with foreigners. Without this is the only choice Japan to survive ourselves. We have the government should come up with that kind of message to the nation. I think that is very important.
Jonathan, you had something to add?
I think Japan has necessity on its side, and it also has a tendency toward gradualism, which is good. I mean, flinging open the doors may be an invitation to problems. I mean, you could criticize Japan as a latecomer to this issue because the need is so great, but in terms of kind of softening the impact on society, the gradualism approach is probably working in Japan's favor. And then it comes back to the how. Like, the worst case scenario I think for Japan would be one where Immigration is still a taboo word. Even maybe the guest worker system is not dealt with forthrightly, but you still have this economic need, so you have all of these kind of secret side doors into immigration. So the foreign population grows, but there's never any real reckoning with it, never any real public consensus behind it. So the resentment grows. People aren't well integrated, and instead of a well integrated foreign workforce, foreign population, you have a still sort of semi-hidden one and a lot of distrust. So I think that what Japan has to do is avoid that. I mean, you can avoid it by closing the door completely, I think, but that's really difficult, or by having a more open, forthright kind of conversation about it. And then there's also the community engagement. I mean, in Canada, there's been a really interesting natural experiment going on the last couple of years in immigration. Canada has accepted, I think it's 60,000 Syrian refugees since 2015. And these are refugees, not economic migrants, but in terms of new Canadians, which is what kind of the standard term in Canada is for immigrants and refugees. They're the most vulnerable, in many ways least equipped people to assimilate. And the majority have been taken care of through government programs, language training, job training, placement help, that kind of thing. And they've done pretty well. But the government has also established a second kind of category or second framework for integrating Syrian refugees, which is private sponsorship. So churches, charities, other civil society, community groups can sponsor a Syrian family. And that makes them the primary kind of point of contact for the family, the place they call when they need help, whatever. And I know people who have been involved in some of these groups. My mother was involved in a sponsoring group. And it's happened, and it's been going on long enough that there has now been some longitudinal studies, some follow-up research on the outcomes for the different groups. The primary reason the government created this program was to basically get community buy-in, right? If it's just the government doing it, you get the sense that it's being shoved down our throats. But if this is like, well, okay, we sponsor one, you sponsor one kind of thing, then you get the sense that the society is behind it. And I think it helped create a general sense in Canada that this is a collective national community effort to bring people in, not something that just the government is doing. And then the other side of it is that these studies, a couple of years later, have shown that although both groups of Syrian refugees have done pretty well in Canadian society in terms of health and employment and that sort of thing, the groups that had private sponsorship have done better, slightly better, because they have this network, because often it's small scale and local. They're not dealing with the same bureaucracies. I mean, for a variety of reasons, the outcomes for the refugees have been good too. So I'm not saying this is something that you could replicate in Japan, but just going to the general principle that the more buy-in you have and participation you have at the receiving end in the community, the better it is for everybody.
There must be an economic side to this as well too, right? So in Australia and Canada, the anti-immigration groups, while they exist, are still relatively fringe because the overall economies are relatively strong. In Australia, we've had 27 years of economic growth. And so immigrants are seen as contributive to that, whereas in many of the European countries, you now see immigrants seen as being subtracting from job opportunity and availability. So I think there is a very strong economic background to that as well. Yes?
Yeah, so my name is Yuan. I'm the Dean of China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai. As an immigrant myself, because I went to France, I became French. Now I'm working in Asia again. So I saw there is a huge contradiction between different group of countries. You mentioned a lot about Canada, Australia, a little bit about Singapore. These are the very short history country with huge diversity to begin with. So the tolerance towards the immigrants are much higher. However, if you look at a case like Germany or France, I'm French now, and there's a very strong national culture. And the problem is that for many of the second and third immigrants, because of the relatively unsuccessfulness of the economy story in the country, they tend to fall back to the original culture. So that's why we had the current debate about the Turkish Germans supporting Erdogan, or the celebration of victory of the football team of Nigeria in France. A lot of contradiction issues. I'm sure that Japan is even less probable than the French and the German culture to tolerate other different languages and cultural background. So please be prepared that if once you start with this diversity, you open the Pandora. Then you need to accept that the rural area people will live with another culture, another language, even another religion, and how you will deal with that in the future. And this will reflect if they got a citizen, and they will reflect in the immigration and even election. So there are a lot of issues. Of course, people don't talk about these nasty issues from beginning, but once you open the Pandora, you have to deal with all these problems. Thank you very much.
It's a good point. Let me ask
I have a question about the highly skilled talent. And as we know that Japan has a system of a green card within 1 year. That is the fastest path in the world, but it's not well known outside the country. And speaking about immigration, not just guest worker import, we need skilled workers anyway, but the war for talent is very, very intense. So what is your view in terms of how we can better accelerate the inflow of that kind of talent?
Anyone like to take that?
Okay. I am not dealing with the high-skilled workers. So what I feel is, okay, my company, we have lots of foreigner workings. Actually, foreigners are more than Japanese. So I see the beauties of having different nationals, people from the different background, mingling together, and chaos brings a lot of new ideas. So I appreciate that. But what I feel with the Japanese companies, especially for the skilled workers, they expect them to act really like Japanese, speaking perfect Japanese, and we are more and more not ready for that yet. Okay, I think it's come from how not only educating the worker side, but it's also come from how we educate our side, maybe from the school days.
I think also the things that people are looking for are very different. The skilled workers are looking for education infrastructure, which Tokyo does lack in a little bit. They're looking for a cultural infrastructure, which in Tokyo can be a little bit difficult to find for people who are not here for a long time. So there are very different things that people are looking for. And I always laugh when I see the discussion in the foreign media sometimes that Japan is a difficult place for foreigners to work because look what happened to Carlos Ghosn. And you sort of think, sorry. But I know that friends and acquaintances think that way. And I could never work in Tokyo because they arrest foreigners there. And so it's a very, very difficult dialogue. It goes well beyond just the economics.
Yeah, and it's a fundamentally different question that Japan has to answer when it comes to white and blue-collar workers. When it comes to blue-collar workers, the question is, shall we open the door? If so, how wide? When it comes to white-collar workers, it's more like, if we open the door, is anybody going to come, right? And it's much more, and you're right, it's not that difficult. Japan's door is pretty wide open. Even before, the introduction of the 1-year fast track to permanent residency, pretty easy if you have a sponsoring company to get a temporary work visa here. When I got permanent residency, I remember, I filled out a 2-page form, and maybe there was a letter that had to go with it. I was like, I'm glad I'm not applying for a green card in America. I'm glad I'm doing this in Japan, I thought, right? I mean, it's actually not that difficult. But the question is, okay, well, if you're going to go, do I want to go to Japan as opposed to Canada, Australia, the U.S., Hong Kong, Singapore, right? And so it's really more about Japan's economy and its companies and their ability to attract people, both in terms of offering competitive wages and in terms of offering a path to promotion. I mean, all of those things. I mean, this is, it's been primarily a discussion about government policy, and the government has done a few things to try and make it more easier and more attractive for highly educated, highly skilled workers to come in. But I don't think they're the one that's going to make the difference. The difference is really more about the companies and the job opportunities here. Yeah.
Tamura-san, on the issue of highly skilled.
Well, I do not have the specific answer to Uezawa-san's question, but SDGs will be a kind of driving force in this case. The reason is, maybe some people know that among foreign students, only 32% will start working in Japanese companies. And of course, the foreign students, all the foreign students do not love to work here in Japan. Most of them want to be back to their own country. However, we have to raise the rate of hiring the foreign students. For that purpose, for the big companies, I think the SDGs will be the very good driver especially to the top management at this moment.
Okay, thank you. And then, lady over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Yuko Kubo. I'm a GLOBIS student now. I feel that the way we are starting to accept or appreciate foreigners coming into Japan more and more is to see them blend into the Japanese culture or appreciate the Japanese culture, and we feel more proud. But I don't feel that we know so much about the people or the culture of the background that these foreigners come from. And how do you think we can the Japanese people appreciate more of the new cultures coming in? So that's my question. Thank you.
I think the education at the early level is very, very important. Just so Ross mentioned there even almost everywhere, especially in Tokyo, in elementary school, in your classroom, there are a couple of foreigners. That's more common in Japan. But those students tend to be isolated, and also they are not their right of study in Japanese schools are not mandatory. So that means if they drop out, schools will not follow. So there is also the government does not have a kind of policy about foreigners living in Japan until recently, so that although the population of the foreigners living in Japan is 2.7, that is the equivalent of the population of Hiroshima Prefecture. But there is not so much statistics itself for them, because the governmental policy was that they are supposed to leave. So there is no such fundamental thinking about foreigners. So but at the same time, those people are the least tapped resources for Japan. But they have a lot of talents and also network and new values, so that they can be used as a way to revitalize Japan. But going back to your question, and I think there should be some places for where Japanese people and foreigners can share their experiences and language experience and culture. So just like kind of global cafe or how should I say, multicultural cafe at the community level, those things that should be created throughout Japan, so that where local people can integrate each other.
Yeah, I think Jonathan's point about community is very important. And I also think, I'm a PR person, so I think that the language is important. I was once a member of a club, and they would have a meeting every week, and there would sometimes be visitors from overseas. And they had this thing here, and it said, "Welcome foreigners." And you sort of think, welcome foreigners. And I suggested that they change it to welcome overseas guests. And after 5 committee meetings, they finally did. But I like Jonathan's idea of new Canadians. If you continue to refer to people from outside as foreigners, then they will always be foreign. And I think it's a dynamic. I also think in the media as well. Sometimes you see the news, And there was one the other day where it was an ATM machine that someone had pulled out and taken away. And the commentary was, 外国人と見られる犯人は. And I'm thinking, what? How do you know? And sometimes that sort of bias comes through. So I think the language is really important, and that needs to come from the government and programs about acceptance. Sorry, the lady.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Gina, and and my question is that with this passing of this new law regarding the immigrants allowing workers here that we call temporary workers, do you think that the government has plans on dealing with the people, with the blue-collar workers who are already working here, since they are already here and their conditions were not as ideal? So do you think that first we have to look on that condition to be able to encourage other workers to come here legally now that now that Japan has a system now, since they passed this law, and this stage is like a testing stage for these temporary workers. So dealing with those people who are already here, is there any plans or system that will make their stay here in accordance with the law that has been passed?
Okay, so I think the new law is effective from April, is open to 14 industry, which is covering the 6 industry affected for the trainee visa. Okay, last year, with the help of Minister of Kono, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, now the Defense, we lobbied to the government saying that we should change the trainees visa system, because the trainee visa it's a work visa, but did not allow the worker to change the jobs. So even they were abused, they had to accept being under that visa because that was the only choice for them. So the new visa system was affected, but what I see is it is still used as extension plan for the trainee visa. So under the trainee visa, you can stay 5 years, but if you pass through this new visa, you can have another 5 years on top of what you have been doing. And then if it's just used as extension of the trainee visa, I don't think that we can attract more workers from overseas. So this is why I feel the system is still half-baked, as Minju Sensei said.
Tamura-san, did you?
Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, the technical intern training and the specific skilled workers, that this is a two similar systems, and the overlap is 11 industries, and that means we do not need technical intern anymore. And I think the Ministry of Justice is supposed to initiate a reform of the institution on the promise that they will abolish technical intern training within 2 years. Within 2 years. I got this information from a reliable source. I believe that. And first, we should unify the system for the blue-collar workers or the guest workers.
From a different angle, I had a chance to give a talk at the JICA's conference on the agriculture issue between Japan and the ASEAN country. And I want to mention this because this will be, I think, very interesting interest for some people. Concerning the relationship between the ASEAN countries, we used to have a more hierarchical relationship, but the gap is now narrowing. And but still, ASEAN countries need technology from us, and Japan now needs human resources. So that now I propose at the conference, I propose a triple win program. That means Japan, the trainees from ASEAN country come to Japan and a choice of going back or stay even though stay in Japan, they can work for their own country, and they serve as a bridge between Japanese communities and ASEAN communities. So my idea is creating some kind of community kind of interaction partnership, like a sister city program. So I think as JICA used to be, actually JICA was created 1974. Before JICA, it was two organizations was merged. One organization is Overseas Immigration Agency. At that time, Japan was sending Japanese people to overseas, so that concerning the history of JICA, now maybe JICA may be involved in the immigration to Japan, I think. So I just propose that.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Last
thanks.
question. Yeah.
Yes. I'm Megutsuda. I'm leading the Diversity and Inclusion Group. My question is about the role of education. Possibly biased parents can raise biased kids. Do you believe that we can start education to kids, then influence the parents? How about your idea?
I think that's a very good point, and we should facilitate it.
Yeah, I don't know if kids who are educated to be less biased will educate their parents to be less biased, but they will eventually replace their parents. The parents will be old, and then eventually they'll die, and then it'll be the kids who are the next generation. So regardless of the knock-on effects to the parents, educating the newest generations is important, right?
I remember when I was young, my mother coming home from the supermarket one day, and she was a little bit upset, and I said, why? And she said, oh, this immigrant lady crashed her trolley into me and she didn't even say sorry. And she was quite upset about this, and it was because this lady was an immigrant lady, and that equaled she was rude. And then I said to my mother, but maybe she doesn't understand the English word for sorry. And my mother said, oh, that could be right, but that was from my experience at school learning another language. So in my case, I think there is definite a dynamic that can work that way. Yes. Benji-san?
I think actually I'm involved in the Japanese education for foreigners in the cultural agency. They are discussing how we can provide Japanese language education to foreigners. But you have to think about the situation of foreigners. Like mother with the children, small children, have no chance to study Japanese. And also blue-collar workers, they're too busy working full-time, and sometimes they work overnight. So that in what way we can provide Japanese language education? The government is trying to provide more education opportunity for the foreigners. But concerning the situation of the blue-collar workers, they have no chance. They can't go to to study Japanese language during daytime, or in what way they can provide. So that is the question. Yeah.
And there's really only so much you can do, I think. I mean, government programs are important. Language education is important. Ultimately, though, if you look at immigration anywhere in the world, grandparents don't speak English. Mom and dad are so-so. The kids integrate. Eventually, 3 generations on, everything's everyone's pretty well integrated. The problem is when you have a system that is premised on the idea that it's only ever one generation. They come, they work for a while, they go home. You're just constantly dealing with new people. I mean, you don't let that natural assimilation happen.
Good point. Mansang-san.
Okay, I don't have so much ideas about education, but what I feel is it's because of the visa system. You didn't see that you would live here long. There was no incentives for learning Japanese. Now it's a starting point. They have opportunities. So hope that Japan can be like a sumo world. Most of the sumo players are not Japanese, yes, and they're speaking Japanese.
Maybe we need to talk to Hori-san and get some classes about diversity and acceptance of working with foreign workers, and for foreign workers to learn Japanese on Manabi Hodai. We can have a special rate, 100 yen each, and then they can just do 15-minute course while they're working as well. Okay, thank you very much for the audience, first of all. Some very good questions and comments from all of you, and thank you very much to my very distinguished panel of guests here today. Thank you.